High in the Silver Pine Mountains, where fog lingers all day and wind sings through the old pines, people whisper about a widow who lives alone on a wooden cabin clinging to the ridge, frail, gentle, with only an aging dog and a wounded bobcat for company. But one night, when strangers crept into her woods, the ground itself began to tremble, and from the dark rose something far greater than fear, the wild strength of the earth, and a love that never died. A soft chirr broke the silence. Not cat, not quite wild. She crouched. In the wedge of shade lay a small bobcat, ribs heaving, left foreleg held tight. Snow dusted its tawny coat, its ear tufts quivered. Those eyes, amber, steady, didn't plead. They measured. Claire felt the old ache of loss stir, the space her husband used to fill when storms cut the road. Easy, she breathed, lowering a blanket. Ranger lay down, calm by design. The bobcat tensed, then accepted the wool and the dark. Claire slid a crate inside, left the door wide, let choices stay choices. Minutes later, the animal limped in, light as fog, and the room rethreaded itself around its breath. Hot water, clean cloth, lavender soap she barely used. The cut ran deep where steel teeth had bitten. Someone had set traps near the creek. A soft chirr broke the silence. Not cat, not quite wild. She crouched. In the wedge of shade lay a small bobcat, ribs heaving, left foreleg held tight. Snow dusted its tawny coat, its ear tufts quivered. Those eyes, amber, steady, didn't plead. They measured. Claire felt the old ache of loss stir, the space her husband used to fill when storms cut the road. Easy, she breathed, lowering a blanket. Ranger lay down, calm by design. The bobcat tensed, then accepted the wool and the dark. Claire slid a crate inside, left the door wide, let choices stay choices. Minutes later, the animal limped in, light as fog, and the room rethreaded itself around its breath. Hot water, clean cloth, lavender soap she barely used. The cut ran deep where steel teeth had bitten. Someone had set traps near the creek. Claire rinsed mud and rust, wrapped the leg, and whispered, "Mara," because the name rose like a tide. Mara watched her hands with a fighter's patience. By dusk, the ridge wore violet. Mara slept near the hearth, not trusting, not fleeing, a hinge between worlds. When the stovepipe ticked, she startled, then settled, ears tracking sounds the cabin never heard. Ranger took the floor nearby, chin on paws. One eye open, 2 sentries, one vow. Night gathered slowly. The hum returned, deeper now, a bass thread under coyotes and surf. Mara rose and moved to the door, nose pressed to the seam. Claire felt it under her soles, the faintest tremor, like something large, exhaling below the frost line. The mountains seemed awake and listening back. She cracked the door. Moonlight laid silver across the yard, unbroken except for a single path of prints leading to the cliff. Mara stepped into the cold, pausing on the threshold, not fear claiming. Ranger stayed inside, watching. Somewhere far off, metal clanged, then stilled as if warned. Claire followed only to the porch rail. Mara stood at the edge of shadow, soaking the night in, head high. When wind should have spoken, a low growl travelled through the ground. No throat, no lungs, a resonance in the planks and Claire's bones. Mara's whiskers trembled, her stance softened to belonging. The sound faded. Mara returned, pausing beside Claire with a brief rub of fur at the hem of her coat. It wasn't affection exactly, it was treaty. Claire closed the door and banked the fire. Ranger sighed, content, as if a burden he'd carried alone had shifted to broader shoulders. Before dawn, Claire woke to quiet. She stepped out to frost that glittered like fallen stars. Around the cabin, fresh prints drew a slow, deliberate ring, as if someone had walked the line of a promise. In the east, the ridge thinned to light. Mara peered from beneath the steps, eyes bright as coals. Claire poured coffee for herself and water for Mara. Steam mingling in the cold. The ground lay still, but its memory hummed. The defenseless feeling that had followed her through long winters was different now, thinner at the edges. Somewhere beneath the roots and shale, something had taken her side. And from the dark rose, something far greater than fear, the wild strength of the earth, and a love that never died. Morning settled soft over Silverpine Ridge. Mara woke by the hearth, testing her bandaged leg with a small, stubborn shift of weight. Claire brewed coffee and warmed broth. The cabin breathing slow. Ranger watched without blinking. The Bobcat's eyes were clearer today, amber coins catching the first tilt of sun. Claire refreshed the wrap with clean gauze and a strip of linen torn from an old shirt. The wound no longer wept, but the flesh around it held the outline of iron teeth. Mara endured the touch, ears twitching, breath steady. When Claire finished, the cat churred once, as if acknowledging a truce. She set out a saucer of water and, after a pause, a thumb-sized piece of venison a neighbour had left. Mara sniffed, considered, then ate with quick, precise bites. Not starving, choosing. Ranger glanced to Claire as if to say, "You're not the only one she's measuring." Trust was a slow bridge. By afternoon, clouds dragged long ribs across the sky. Claire opened the door and let the cold through. Mara limped to the threshold, inhaling the edge of snow and spruce. She touched the porch plank with her good paw, then stepped back, content to watch the yard breathe while heat clung to her fur. Twilight came blue and early. The hum rose faintly from the ground, quieter than last night, but unmistakable. Mara stood, ears finding the note under the floorboards. She moved to the door again. Claire didn't stop her. She unlatched the seam and let silver air pour in. Ranger stayed inside, sentinel calm. Mara slipped out and vanished under the steps. Minutes stretched. Claire held the jam, feeling the tremor pass through the frame like a far train. Then the Bobcat reappeared, coat salted with frost, whiskers pearled, mud smeared her bandage. She had gone somewhere she didn't want the house to see. They repeated the ritual for days. The careful cleaning, the measured feeding, the way Mara touched the doorway like a prayer before night. Each dawn, she returned with new smells braided into her fur. Wet stone, alder bark, the cold metal scent of creek bed. The wound knitted, Her stride grew sure. On the fourth evening, wind dropped to a hush that made small sounds ring. Claire heard a metallic clink from beyond the woodpile, thin and mean. Ranger stiffened. Mara froze, shoulders rising. She limped toward it anyway, all purpose. Claire followed with a lantern, light wobbling over frost and splinters. They found it at the edge of brush, an old spring trap someone had tossed and half buried. No fresh blood, just rust and a single grey hair. Mara circled, low, eyes hard. Claire knelt and covered the steel with a shovel of dirt, then another, until the shape became only earth. The cat's breath eased. Back inside, the ridge seemed to exhale. Claire warmed a towel and dried Mara's paws, one by one, speaking low about nothing. Coffee tins, missing buttons, the storm due Friday. The bobcat watched her mouth as if tasting the weather in each word. Ranger's tail thumped twice against the floorboards. Snow fell overnight, a quiet sieve. At daybreak, Claire opened to a clean slate. Across the yard, new tracks stitched a slow circle around the cabin, wider than before, deliberate. Mara stepped out and pressed her paw into the first drift. Claiming the morning, the mountain hummed like a distant choir. They walked the porch length together, woman, dog, wildcat, without touching. The silence between them felt knit, not empty. When the sun shouldered through the low cloud, Mara blinked, then returned to the hearth on her own terms. Claire banked the fire and wrote a single word in her notebook, staying. Claire held the jam, feeling the tremor pass through the frame like a far train. Then the bobcat reappeared, coat salted with frost, whiskers pearled. Mud smeared her bandage. She had gone somewhere she didn't want the house to see. They repeated the ritual for days, the careful cleaning, the measured feeding, the way Mara touched the doorway like a prayer before night. Each dawn she returned with new smells braided into her fur. Wet stone, alder bark, the cold metal scent of creek bed. The wound knitted. Her stride grew sure. On the fourth evening, wind dropped to a hush that made small sounds ring. Claire heard a metallic clink from beyond the woodpile, thin and mean. Ranger stiffened. Mara froze, shoulders rising. She limped toward it anyway, all purpose. Claire followed with a lantern, light wobbling over frost and splinters. They found it at the edge of brush, an old spring trap someone had tossed and half buried. No fresh blood, just rust and a single grey hair. Mara circled, low, eyes hard. Claire knelt and covered the steel with a shovel of dirt, then another, until the shape became only earth. The cat's breath eased. Back inside, the ridge seemed to exhale. Claire warmed a towel and dried Mara's paws, one by one, speaking low about nothing, coffee tins, missing buttons, the storm due Friday. The bobcat watched her mouth, as if tasting the weather in each word. Ranger's tail thumped twice against the floorboards. Snow fell overnight, a quiet sieve. At daybreak, Claire opened to a clean slate. Across the yard, new tracks stitched a slow circle around the cabin, wider than before, deliberate. Mara stepped out and pressed her paw into the first drift. Claiming the morning, the mountain hummed like a distant choir. They walked the porch length together, woman, dog, Wildcat without touching. The silence between them felt knit, not empty. When the sun shouldered through the low cloud, Mara blinked, then returned to the hearth on her own terms. Claire banked the fire and wrote a single word in her notebook, staying. The thaw came slow, turning snow to lace along the fence rails. Claire was mending a torn sleeve when a truck climbed the switchbacks and stopped below the porch. Eli Barnes stepped out, shoulders square, eyes scanning the ridge the way old rangers do. Like he was reading a pulse, he greeted Ranger first, palm low, then tipped his cap to Claire. "Heard you've had restless nights," he said. The ground underfoot held yesterday's hush. Claire poured coffee and didn't mention the bobcat. A stray can be a rumor. A wildcat is a decision you don't share. Eli set a topo map on the table, corners curling like leaves. Orange stakes had appeared along the creek. He said survey flags with Norvale's stamp. "They call it sampling," he added, "but it sounds like drilling." Claire felt the cabin tighten, Wood remembering how to brace. While they talked, a shadow crossed the window, quick, soundless, sure as handwriting. Ranger flicked an ear. Eli didn't turn, not right away. He let the moment pass, then folded the map. "Anything unusual on your side of the fence?" he asked gently, like a door left on the latch. Claire's answer was the quiet kind, the kind that isn't quite a lie. "Foxes are bold this year." Eli looked past her to the porch rail, where a single tuft of tawny fur snagged like a bookmark. He didn't reach for it. "Bold comes in shapes," he said. "Some shapes choose us back." Afternoon burned cold and blue. Eli stepped outside to check the eaves, claiming he wanted to see ice damage. From the yard he spotted her Mara, perched on the cabin ridgepole, like a weather vane, paws tucked, ear tufts combing the wind, not hiding, watching her country from a high line. He held still, hat in his hand, and let her measure him. Mara's eyes carried the color of resin in old pine, alert but unafraid. A low tremor rolled through the planks. Eli felt it in his arches, the faintest drum under bone. "That hum," he murmured, not asking, more like remembering. Claire joined him with 2 chipped mugs. "It's worse near dark," she said. Mara traced the roof seam, a soft step, then another, and vanished over the far slope. Ranger didn't give chase. He knew the treaty lines. Eli took a slow sip and watched the roof shed a small slide of frost. He spoke of the old collapse at the Sutton Cut, the one that took Harold and buried a winter road. "Some caves breathe," he said, "and some of them growl when pushed." He pointed toward the flagged creek bed. "If they punch there, the whole basin could shudder like a spooked herd." Dusk came early, ink pooling in the brush. From the timberline came a dry metallic ping, followed by nothing. Mara reappeared near the woodshed, moving clean despite the mended leg, nose high, reading metal from air. She paused, eyes angling toward the creek, then toward Claire. The hum swelled subtle, steady until lantern glass whispered. Eli set his mug down. "That's not wind," he said. Mara stepped onto the porch, brushed the post with a deliberate sweep of whiskers, and faced the dark as if posting a guard. Somewhere, a flag snapped and went still. Inside, they spread the map again. Eli drew a penciled ring around Claire's acreage, then widened it to the slope above the creek. "This is where we hold," he said. Claire nodded, feeling the ridge breathe under her soles. Mara settled by the door, eyes lit with coals that would not go out. Morning came sharp and glassy, sun skimming the crusted snow like a blade. Claire swept the porch, listening for that buried note the ridge sometimes played. Mara lay under the steps, awake behind half-closed eyes, breath slow, reading air the way water reads its banks. Ranger kept a lazy watch, ears doing the work. By mid-morning, a white pickup wound up the switchbacks, tires biting gravel. 3 men climbed out, bright vests over field jackets, clipboards in hand. Their smiles were business-wide, practiced, weightless. The tallest introduced himself as Davis, then nodded at Cole and Reed, like tools laid in a row. "Routine survey," Davis said, eyes slipping past Claire toward the creek. Colder eyes did the measuring. He flashed papers, permits, signatures, a logo that looked expensive. Cole scanned the tree line. Reed kicked a post and smirked. Under the steps, Mara's ear tuft twitched once, then stilled. Claire kept her voice level, the way you talk to weather. She asked what they were sampling, how long they'd be on the ridge. Davis spoke of soils and public good, language with its laces tied tight. He marked a point on the road with neon flagging and said they'd set camp at the flat near the alders. When the truck left, the yard exhaled in the smallest way. Mara slid from the shadow, crossed the porch with a silent, certain step, and pressed whiskers to the doorframe. A claim, a boundary drawn in things that don't show on maps. Ranger swung his head toward the creek. Claire felt the planks think. They arrived at dusk with gear that clanked and lights that didn't care about owls. Lantern cones cut the alder thicket into bright pieces. Davis barked tasks. Cole drove stakes. Reed uncoiled cable that hummed like bad bees. Claire watched from the porch. Mara vanished, not fleeing, absorbing. The first strike came soft. A handheld probe, punching frozen soil with a quick metallic gasp. The second went deeper. The ground answered with a faint, patient groan, a sound you'd miss if you didn't live with wood and stone. Cole paused, chin lifted. Reed laughed too loud and kept driving steel. Mara reappeared at the edge of light, low and long, every muscle written in clean lines. She fixed on the probe, then on Davis's hands. The glow caught her eyes and threw twin embers into the night. Reed saw them and stepped back with a word that wasn't brave. Davis steadied him with a flat look. The men worked faster, cables braided through brush. A generator coughed awake and settled into a cheap, grinding rhythm. With each pulse, the soil shivered tiny, distrustful. On the porch, Claire felt it lift through the joists like a warning. Mara's tail flicked once, a metronome set to not yet. Then the ridge spoke up, not loud, a low rounding growl that travelled through roots and stones and 100 winters of buried wood. The lanterns trembled on their hooks. The generator hiccuped and died politely, as if excusing itself. Reed swore. Cole's stake rammer slipped and bit his glove. Davis looked toward the cabin, into the dark between porch posts where a bobcat shaped the night. He didn't see Claire's face. He saw the distance in Mara's eyes, how old it was, how unbothered. He broke the stare first and told his crew to call it for the evening. Different soil, he said. Thin. They left their flags and a mess of tracks in clean snow. When the engine noise thinned to nothing, the ridge eased, the way a held breath leaves a room. Mara stepped onto the porch, brushed the rail, then stood facing the emptiness they'd made. Ranger came to heel beside her. Sentinel answering sentinel. Claire brought warm water to the bowl and a small plate of scraps. Mara didn't eat. She listened. The hum lowered until it became memory. Inside, Claire banked the stove and set her hand to the map Eli left, tracing the creek with a fingertip. Outside, the Bobcat watched the valley tighten its grip on night. Claire held the jam, feeling the tremor pass through the frame like a far train. Then the Bobcat reappeared, coat salted with frost, whiskers pearled. Mud smeared her bandage. She had gone somewhere she didn't want the house to see. They repeated the ritual for days, the careful cleaning, the measured feeding, the way Mara touched the doorway like a prayer before night. Each dawn she returned with new smells braided into her fur. Wet stone, alder bark, the cold metal scent of creek bed. The wound knitted. Her stride grew sure. On the fourth evening, wind dropped to a hush that made small sounds ring. Claire heard a metallic clink from beyond the woodpile, thin and mean. Ranger stiffened. Mara froze, shoulders rising. She limped toward it anyway, all purpose. Claire followed with a lantern, light wobbling over frost and splinters. They found it at the edge of brush, an old spring trap someone had tossed and half buried. No fresh blood, just rust and a single grey hair. Mara circled, low, eyes hard. Claire knelt and covered the steel with a shovel of dirt, then another, until the shape became only earth. The cat's breath eased. Back inside, the ridge seemed to exhale. Claire warmed a towel and dried Mara's paws, one by one, speaking low about nothing, coffee tins, missing buttons, the storm due Friday. The Bobcat watched her mouth, as if tasting the weather in each word. Ranger's tail thumped twice against the floorboards. Snow fell overnight, a quiet sieve. At daybreak, Claire opened to a clean slate. Across the yard, new tracks stitched a slow circle around the cabin, wider than before, deliberate. Mara stepped out and pressed her paw into the first drift. Claiming the morning, the mountain hummed like a distant choir. They walked the porch length together, woman, dog, wildcat, without touching. The silence between them felt knit, not empty. When the sun shouldered through the low cloud, Mara blinked, then returned to the hearth on her own terms. Claire banked the fire and wrote a single word in her notebook, staying. The thaw deepened, turning last week's crust into a skin that sighed under boots. Claire walked the creek rim with Eli, Ranger padding close. Mara moved ahead in a low, elastic trot, heeled enough to test the slope. The air smelled like wet iron and alder sap. Somewhere below, the ridge kept its quiet drum. They reached the old cut where storms had chewed the bank years ago. Snow slumped back from a seam in the earth, dark as a held breath. Mara halted, tail stiff, ears pricked at the crack's faint whisper. Eli crouched, palm flat on soil. The ground hummed once, like a big heart turning over. He traced a fracture spidering toward the dry falls. "She's venting under here," he said, voice low. "Pockets, voids, a cave that breathes." Claire's mouth went dry. 10 winters ago, Harold had vanished near this runout. Mara stepped to the edge and read the dark like a page left open. Eli eased a headlamp down, catching wet stone, old roots, glints of mica. He found scratch marks along a narrow ledge, fresh crescents, broader than coyote, set wide. "Not lion," he murmured. "Bobcat. Big one." Mara's whiskers fanned, then smoothed, as if the marks answered a question only she asked. They moved upstream. In a pocket of melt, Eli found bones weathered to parchment deer, small mammal, and one twisted spring from a trap. He lifted it with 2 fingers and hissed softly, "Someone's still laying steel." Mara's body went quiet, not frozen. A decision rippled through muscle and air. Claire told him, haltingly, about Harold and the winter collapse, how he'd carried a wounded bobcat queen in his jacket, saying, "You get one good favor from a mountain if you pay attention." The storm had taken the road, then him. For years, the ridge sang that note, like a name she couldn't hear back. Eli pulled his glove off and pressed skin to rock. The hum rose, steadier now, a bass thread under snowmelt. "I think she remembers," he said, not sure if he meant the mountain or the cat. Mara stepped onto a fallen trunk and scanned the ravine with the patience of a sentry on home ground. A metallic tick drifted from below cable brushing stone, then silence. Mara ghosted down slope, light on heeled paw, slipped through alder switches, and vanished into a crease the lamp couldn't hold. Ranger whined once. Claire started after, but Eli caught her sleeve. Let her do her work. Minutes stretched thin. The creek bed exhaled cold. Then the ground spoke, one lengthened growl that came up through their bones. It wasn't threat, it was a warning, carried along buried beams and old root. A startled shout clanged off rock, followed by frantic scrabble, then a thud and the dumb hush after. Mara reappeared, shoulders high, coat dusted with wet grit. Something like pride lived in the angle of her head. Behind her, a tangle of cable sagged into the melt and slipped free, dead weight. The ridge settled by degrees, the way a taut line lets go without singing whip. They followed her to a shallow overhang where the seam widened. On the stone lip, new scratches crossed older ones, layered stories in claw. Eli widened his circle with the lamp and found a few grey hairs matted in mud, older, longer, not Mara's. Another bobcat used this run, maybe the same big one. Claire knelt, fingers hovering over the scars. The marks led inward, then back out, as if something large turned and stood guard. She pictured Harold with his jacket bundled to his chest, snow in his beard, stubborn as the ridge. The hum softened until it felt like the cabin's stove at midnight. They headed home at blue hour, Mara ranging ahead, doubling back to brush Claire's boot with a purposeful pass. It wasn't affection exactly, it was escort. Up on the porch, she posted herself by the corner post and faced the ravine. Ranger sat beside her, 2 silhouettes, same job, different world. Inside, Eli marked the map, circling the seam and the dry falls, then drawing a line to the flagged creek flats. "If Norvale punches there," he said, "they'll wake what keeps this basin stitched." Claire watched frost climb the window pane, taller than a hand. The ridge thrummed its quiet ascent. Night took the timberline and left a thin silver on the road. Claire stepped out with 2 bowls, set them down, and stood a moment in the mild ache of remembering. Mara glanced up, eyes bright and sure, then looked back to the dark seam where the ground had a voice. The mountain grew still again. Listening back, Night slid in on felt feet, smoothing the ridge to charcoal. Claire banked the fire and checked the latch twice, the way winter teaches. Mara dozed by the door, ears catching threads of sound the cabin couldn't hold. Ranger breathed slow on the rug. Somewhere below, the mountain kept its patient hum. Wind fluted the stovepipe, then stilled. From the yard came a noise, too careful for weather, the hush of boots, testing boards. Breath held the way men hold it when they don't belong. Mara's head lifted. She didn't growl. She calculated. The cabin's old timbers answered with a warning creak. Glass whispered in the mudroom. A lock probed, then clicked, thin as a needle through cloth. Ranger rose, hackles a quiet tide. Claire reached for the lantern and steadied the shade to stop its chatter. Mara stepped between the door and Claire, tail low, body drawn, long as a question. 2 silhouettes ghosted down the hall. The narrow stoop of Reed, the square frame of Davis behind him. Flashlights dark to keep the house blind. "Find it," Reed breathed, greed in a whisper. Davis's hand swept the wall, mapping shadows. Mara gauged distance, then slid to the stair, vanishing. Claire spoke first, voice even. "Turn around." The men flinched, light leaping on rafters, then landing on Ranger. Davis saw the dog and set his jaw. "What's here isn't yours," Claire said. Reed shouldered past. His boots skidded on kindling. The house seemed to draw itself taller around them. Mara broke cover, a tawny streak, striking Reed's shin with a warning rake. Not full claws, a measured line. He yelled and swung his flashlight. It cracked against the doorframe and died. For a breath, darkness had bones. The ground underfoot gave the tiniest pulse, like a heart testing a beat. Davis lunged, grabbing for Mara. She rolled clean, landed light on the bad leg, didn't falter, and set herself between Claire and the men. Ranger advanced 1 step, held, the treaty still in force. Reed fumbled for his boot knife. The knife found air. The floor found its voice and spoke. It began as a pressure, a bass thread travelling up nails and joists, then opened into a long, tunneling growl that did not belong to throats. The porch boards answered, the cabinets whispered in their hinges, the lantern chimed, dust lifted in the beam, like breath exposed to cold. Reed stumbled back, spine meeting wall. Davis steadied himself with both hands and stared at the floor as if it had moved. From beneath the stepwell came a darker shape, gravity wrapped in muscle. Another bobcat, larger, coat smoked with earth, eyes lit like banked coals, disturbed. The big cat didn't charge. It occupied. 1 pace forward pressed silence into the room. a boundary laid without paper. Mara flicked an ear and shifted aside, making space as to a senior. The growl threaded the planks again, deeper now, as if the ridge had leaned in to hear itself. Out, Claire said, not loud. The word rode the resonance like a leaf on current. Reed bolted first, elbowing past the door jamb, boots ricocheting off the porch. Davis hesitated, ambition tugging at his sleeve, then caught the animal's eyes and understood the size of the country he stood in. They fell into the yard, lights wild in their hands, and ran a bent line to the truck. Tires spat gravel, gears ground. Then the curve took them, and they were gone. The mountain released the last held note. The cabinets settled. The lantern's ring sighed itself quiet in a slow circle. Mara stood until the hum gentled. The larger cat eased back into shadow, not vanishing so much as returning to its depth, an ember reburied. Ranger exhaled and sat. Claire lowered the lantern and pressed fingers to the rail to feel the afterbeat. The house remembered how to be a house again. She fetched a bowl and set it by the door. Mara didn't touch it yet. She walked the threshold once, whiskers combing the air where men had just breathed, then brushed Claire's shin with a brief, sure pass. Outside, the ridge drew the night close. Inside, warmth collected in the old wood. Morning came slow and forgiving, pale light rinsing the porch where boot scuffs had torn last night's quiet. Claire swept grit into a neat pile, feeling the boards breathe again. Mara dozed beneath the steps, not asleep so much as idling ears half-cocked, eyes slivered, a sentinel conserving flame. A county SUV wound up the grade, tires whispering gravel. Sheriff Nora Briggs stepped out, winter jacket zipped to the throat, gaze taking in the yard in one clear pass. She greeted Ranger with a palm-down nod, then the house itself, as if asking the old timbers to tell their side first. Inside, Nora listened while Claire spoke sparely. Men, flashlights, the wrong kind of careful. The sheriff asked for the path they took and the room where the floor had talked. On the jamb, she found a nick of metal. On the sill, a crescent of mud. On the mat, a single tawny hair curled like smoke. They walked the porch line. Near the corner post, Nora crouched to trace prints with a gloved finger Bobcat. Then Bobcat again, one light and small, one broader, weight set deeper in the heel pads. Between them ran a shaved ribbon in the frost, where a tail had signed the air without touching. Mara slipped out like a thought crossing itself, and stood in the daylight. She wasn't coy. She took the sheriff's measure, as she'd taken snow and wind, head high, whiskers forward. A low tremor moved the boards under their boots. A drumbeat felt more than heard. Nora didn't reach. She let it pass through. 2 cats? She said softly. Claire nodded once. One knows the door, Claire added. Mara's ear flicked at the word. From the slope, a darker shape shifted the light, and was still again, presence more than body. Ranger watched both edges at once, tail writing slow confidence on the air. Nora stood and scanned the creek flats, where flags still screamed colour. I'll file the trespass, she said, and note the traps. As for unusual wildlife on private land, she let the rest hang like thaw fog. The mountain hummed again, lower, satisfied. Mara glazed her claws on the post, delicate as thread. Word moves in small towns like steam through sawdust. By noon, diners knew about the break-in. By 2, someone swore the ridge had roared. Nora ignored the chatter and radioed Eli for a map check. She kept her report. Clean men entered, men fled, boundary cats observed, no aggression unless pushed. At the creek edge, she marked the legal line with a pencil, then stepped back inside the line as if it warmed her boots. Mara paced a slow arc just beyond, nose-sifting currents only she could read. Every few strides, she pressed cheek to wood, laying a seam between house and world. Nora left near dusk. At the truck door she paused, looking past Claire to the threshold where wild and domestic touched without argument. Some places enforce their own peace, she said. I'll take the long way down. When she drove off, even the gravel seemed to move quieter under the tires. Evening gathered like blue felt. Mara posted at the corner again, eyes burning down to coals, tail ticking a metronome only the ridge understood. From the timberline came a brush of shadow, the larger cat holding distance, unseen until you accepted it had a right to be there. The hum settled to memory. Claire set out water and a scrap plate the cat ignored. Mara lifted her head to the wind, then tipped it toward Claire in a gesture that wasn't thanks so much as acknowledgement, 2 keepers of one hinge. The house drew its breath, the ridge kept its promise, and night closed the seam without a sound. Dawn came mild and blue, a soft rinse over Silverpine Ridge. Claire stepped onto the porch with her mug and felt the boards warm under sun. Mara stretched from beneath the steps, testing each pore like a musician tuning strings. The bandaged leg moved clean now, strength returning, one quiet fibre at a time. Ranger rose and gave way, leaving Mara the corner post. The bobcat set her cheek to it, whiskers combing the grain, as if stitching the house back to the hill. Claire spoke in the low way she'd learned a weather report, not a command. Mara listened without looking, the listening that counts. By afternoon, the wind went slack, and every sound carried farther. In that hush, Mara's ears found distant signals. A jay's scold, a vole's brief mistake, and something older, deeper stone speaking to itself. She walked the porch edge, sidestepping the light, then paused, reading the slope like braille. She left at twilight, no drama, just absence shaped like a cat. Claire held the door longer than needed, counting heartbeats until the hum below took up its familiar seat. The ground's voice was quieter tonight, wrapped in moss. Ranger watched the timberline and chose stillness as his answer. Mara moved through alder and snow rot, a silent paragraph between trees. She touched rocks with pads that remembered traps and chose faith anyway. At the dry falls, she stopped. In silt soft as flour lay prints, not hers, wider, heavier, set in pairs like careful footnotes. She lowered her head and inhaled history. The first call rose thin and far, not a cougar's long blade, not a coyote's chatter, but a bobcat yowl stretched into a thread of wire. Another answered from the opposite slope, shorter, throatier, then a third, lower still, like an old hinge that refused to fail. Mara stood in the center of the cord. It swelled until the ravine carried it, the way a church roof carries him. The ground gave a consenting murmur, that bass note the ridge keeps for itself. For a breath, silver threads crossed the living and the below ground, and Mara felt the seam hold. She tipped her head back and added one clean line. Peak past like weather does. Sound thinned to a hum you could pocket. In the quiet that follows truth, Mara worked the perimeter up, past the stove-cut cedar, down the shale chute, around the flagged flats where men had pried. She rubbed her face on a stump, already rich with old cat and winter smoke. Back at the cabin, Claire set a bowl and didn't expect it taken. She wrote a single line in her notebook, voices in threes, and underlined it twice. Ranger lifted his head, heard the last tail of the chorus, and put it down again with a sigh that meant home. The stove clicked once, agreeing. Near midnight, a light snow moved in, without ambition. Mara returned along her shallow groove, head high, whiskers iced. She paused at the porch step and touched it with one paw, the way you greet a friend without waking them. Claire, awake anyway, felt it in the floor like a soft knock. She opened the door to steam and pine and let the cold braid itself through the room. Mara passed, a draught with weight. She circled once by the hearth, then chose the threshold, facing the dark. The house relaxed around her as if a brace had found its notch. Ranger rolled, conceding the watch. Before sleep, Claire pictured the prints at the falls, two arches meeting. She imagined the larger cat holding back where light ends, keeping company without claim. The ridge hummed in its pillow, satisfied. Somewhere, the survey flags learned how to be still. The night closed like a careful book. At first, light, world, and window matched. Claire stepped out to a yard, stitched by fresh tracks. Mara's small, the elder's broader, a shared circuit widening like a promise. The mountain kept its counsel. Mara blinked at the day, then pressed cheek to the post once more, and everything felt newly anchored. Morning came bright and brittle, sun cutting hard angles through the alders. Down on the flats, Norvale's crew returned with bigger teeth-auger rig, fuel drums, spools of cable, flags snapped like small lies. From the porch, Claire watched without waving. Mara watched the ground, not the men. The Bobcat moved the yard's edge in a slow figure eight, whiskers reading wires, tail measuring wind. Ranger held the stoop, weight on his forepaws. The ridge was quiet in that bothered way silence that hums behind your ribs. When the drill coughed to life, the porch gave a faint, answering tick. Steel met soil with a shudder that travelled up Claire's ankles. Mara froze, head tilted, ears triangling on the auger's bite. The first run chewed shallow and spit mud. The second dug harder, and the earth gave back a bruised note, low and round, like a warning swallowed once already. Eli came quick from the switchbacks, map tube under his arm. He didn't bother with greetings. His eyes found Mara, then the drill. "That seam won't hold a push," he said. "They punch there," the basin answers. Claire nodded, but her focus held on the Bobcat's breath, small and even. Operators fed more throttle. The rig leaned. Cables rattled like angry vines. The hum returned, building in the boards, then in the joists, then in the lantern glass on its hook. Mara rose to the rail and stood tall, a thin animal holding an old line, listening deeper than human instruments can. She slipped off the porch and moved downhill, not stalking so much as staking claim. Her route traced last night's shared circuit, a path widened by a heavier set of paws. At the dry falls she stopped, placed one pad on cold stone, and let the tremor choose a throat. The ridge obliged. It started as a breath turning over, then a long, travelling growl that walked the buried beams and came up through alder roots. The drill choked, caught, choked again. Bolts quivered, fuel cans rattled a nervous chorus. Reed shouted something about pressure. Davis barked back, eyes narrowing. Mara stepped into the open, like a bell sounding. From the timber's shade, the larger bobcat showed itself, smoked coat, old scars, eyes like banked fire. They didn't charge. They occupied. 2 points in a line the ridge had already drawn, standing where the auger wanted to own the ground. The growl broadened until it became place planks thrumming at Claire's back, stones speaking in Eli's boots. The rig's head danced, then bit air. A cable snapped with a whine and laid itself down like a swallowed whip. Men swore and grabbed and failed to make the hill forget them. Davis met Mara's gaze and saw no anger there, just a country unwilling to be measured. Something in him tallied risk versus pride. He cut his hand in a circle, a retreat that pretended to be strategy. Engines stuttered off. The quiet that followed filled with breath they hadn't noticed losing. For a long minute, nothing moved. Then the ridge exhaled, the growl easing back into roots and water. The elder bobcat turned first, melting into shade. Mara held a beat longer, then brushed her cheek against the flagged stake and left it with a different meaning. The flag went very still. Crew packed in a hurry that wanted to look calm. Tires found gravel. The flats remembered how to be flats again. Eli drew a line on the map with a blunt pencil and circled the hole that didn't become a hole. Claire rested a palm on the porch rail, feeling the afterbeat settle to warmth. Mara climbed the steps and took the corner post, eyes dimming to amber coals. Ranger sat beside her, chest rising slow. The mountain kept its counsel, satisfied for now. In Claire's notebook, a new line. When the ground spoke, we listened. Outside, the flags learned a gentler kind of quiet. Spring unspooled in slow greens. Flags vanished from the flats, replaced by mud and older catkins. Norvale's rig did not return. Claire walked the porch with a quiet she trusted now, coffee warm in her hands. Mara lay along the threshold, eyes half-lidded, the house and hill stitched together by her breath. Eli brought papers in a weathered folder, edges softened by glove and map. Private reserve, he said. Mara's hollow signed and recorded. Sheriff Nora added a note about traps and trespass, then closed her book with a look that said the ridge had made its case. The mountain answered with a low assent. They posted a small cedar sign at the gate. No fuss, no sermon, just a name and a promise. Mara watched from the porch rail, whiskers tasting the new word in the air. The elder cat held to the timberline, seen and not seen, a shadow that belonged the way granite belongs to weather. Days found their rhythm. Claire mended, planted, listened. The ground's hum came only at dusk now, a kindly engine idling under roots. Mara resumed her precise patrol porch to stump, stump to seam, seam to falls maps written in paw and cheek. Ranger trailed 2 paces back, content to read the margin. Letters arrived, neighbours, hikers, a science teacher who wanted to bring respect, not cameras. Claire answered what helped and let the rest slide past. Eli drafted guidelines no one would notice if they were the right kind of visitor. Nora arranged the kind of silence that keeps a place whole. On a windless evening, the ridge called in that low register the house knew by heart. Mara stilled, then slipped to the yard's edge. From the dark, the elder Bobcat stepped into moonlight and stopped. 2 sets of eyes held Claire's porch, 2 breaths braided with the hum until time felt wider. Peak found them without hurry. The ground voiced a long, rounded growl, the kind that refuses argument. Somewhere beyond the alders, a forgotten stake tipped and fell. Claire felt Harold in the porch boards. Not a ghost, a memory taught to wood. She stood very still and let the country pass through her. When the note eased, the elder cat turned first, melting back to timber. Mara remained, touching the post with a slow drag of whiskers, as if sealing a signature, and returned to the threshold. She did not look back. Guardians don't explain. They confirm that the hinge still holds. Summer moved in like a friend who knows where the cups are. The creek's voice came up a little, talking rock instead of drill. Mara hunted alone and with the shadow both, never far, never late. Claire learned to sleep with the door cracked, trusting the night to finish its own sentences. One morning brought absence shaped like a cat. Prints led to the ravine and thinned to stone. Claire waited through noon, through dusk, through a quiet that wasn't empty. At moonrise, a single yowl floated down the seam, clear, adult, unafraid. Ranger's ears tipped. Claire smiled into the dark. Weeks later, Eli delivered the last copy of the deed and left a pencil on the map, dull and honest. Nora stopped by, looked at the porch and the post and the hill, and said, "That'll do." The house had fewer creaks now, as if it had set its weight in the right place and was willing to stay. At the first cold of fall, the ground sent one brief growl through the boards, a handshake you feel more than hear. Mara returned at dawn, larger in the shoulders. Amber eyes steady, she brushed Claire's coat in passing and took her post. The ridge kept its counsel. The defenseless feeling was gone. If this story touched your heart, just drop a 1 in the comments, or a 0 if it stayed quiet inside you. Don't forget to subscribe. There are more gentle stories waiting just beyond the trees.